Alright, hey guys, welcome back to a whole new Unreal Engine 4 tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to do basically kind of like a simple character selection screen. This is part 1 of maybe part 2 or 3 in total. We'll see how far I want to take it. But if you haven't seen the previous progress video for this kind of blueprint, go ahead and check out the link in the description. I'll also put an annotation at this point so you guys can click on it and check it out. I can't show you right now just because I'm creating it from a whole new project and my laptop's not that good to run basically two instances of Unreal. So just check out that video. It's only like 30 something seconds, so check that out real quick and then come back and we'll go ahead and build it from scratch. So I'm using Unreal Engine 4.15. So if you're not using 0.15, you're not going to be able to use the blur component of the UMG widget. So that should be the only difference, aside from some aesthetic stuff they've changed. They made things look a little like smoother and kind of rounder with some of the nodes. But for the most part, you'll be able to follow the tutorial aside from the blur. So let's go ahead and get started. So I have here, again, 4.15, but it's a completely empty project. I didn't want to have anything for like the shooter project or anything like that. I just wanted my own content. So if you do the way I do, go ahead and make sure you create a game mode. So you just right click blueprint class, hit game mode base, and you'll be given this. And this is where you go ahead and put in your pawn if you have one, HUD classes, PC, player controller classes, things like that. But the last thing we'll need is also a player controller. So right click blueprint class, player controller, right there, and you'll get this. Now, the player controller, this is where we're going to do a couple different things. If you look on the right-hand side here, you'll have a section called mouse interface. So this is where you go ahead and give it some mouse parameters. So what you'll want to do, show mouse cursor. Yes, we want to do that because it's a UMG element. We want to make sure, as soon as you spawn, you'll see the UMG element that we're going to be making, and you'll see your mouse. We also want to enable click events. And enable mouse over events. We want to check that. Enabling touch over events, that's just for like handheld devices or any devices that use touch for touchscreen. And the last thing here, click event keys, we'll leave it at default left mouse button. That's going to be the key that it recognizes when you try to click on something. So you could theoretically make that the right mouse button. You can make it any button you want. But we are just going to make it the left mouse button by default. So that's the setup you need in order to get this working. Obviously, if we play in editor, nothing's happening, but you do see our mouse, which is nice. But if you do click and hold, you'll be able to move the camera, and WASD kind of moves the camera around. That's not a big deal for what we're going to be doing, which is also just a simple UMG element at this point. So I created a core folder where I put these two elements in, the game mode and the player controller. Also, before I forget, when you're done making your player controller, just make sure you assign it to the player controller class here, as well as any other classes that you have. So a pawn class, a game state class if you have one, and just also make sure in the world settings of your level you override the game mode to the game mode you just made. So that's all you really need to do. Now we can actually get started. So I have a UMG folder. We're going to right click, scroll all the way down to user interface, widget blueprint. I'm going to name it BP underscore UI underscore character selection underscore main. And just for the purposes of making sure that everything's working, what we're going to first do is just grab an image. So you can just type in image, drag it into the canvas panel. And what I'd like to do is go to anchors and just grab this anchor at the very bottom right. It expands it all. And if you look at the offset settings for offset right, offset bottom, just make them both 0 and it'll just expand the whole thing. So we're going to save this and we're just going to make sure we can actually see this white screen when we play. So if we do that right now, see, we're not going to see it because we didn't tell it to draw or create the widget or anything like that. So what we're going to do that is in the player controller. Let me get rid of the game mode. So on event begin play, what we're going to do here is first let's set the input type yeah, set input mode, and I'll just say UI only, just because, you know, it's just a UI. And it expects a widget to focus on, so that's what we're going to go ahead and give it. So we're going to right click, we're going to type in create widget. We're going to connect that to the event begin play. The class right now is our main selection here. And owning player, we could just give it self. So that's what we're going to do, because it's a player controller that we're in. If you were to do this in like your character or pawn class, you would have to, you know, get the owning controller of a specific player index if that's how you want to go about doing it. But since we're in a player controller, we could just use self, which is nice. And now the return value, we're going to put that into widget to focus on. And the mouse lock mode, I like to just use lock always. Just lock the mouse, make sure you can't leave the window or anything like that. You can set that to whatever you want, but that's what I would prefer. And then we're just going to connect this up. And that's pretty much it, but the target is one thing that we're missing. It's expecting a player controller reference. So just throw in self in like that, or, you know, if you want to be super organized, just create a copy of it. And now you would expect it to work right now, but of course it's not. And the reason why is because, you know, we haven't added it to our viewport. So let's just grab the return value of our create widget function. And just type in add viewport. So add to viewport. You could also do add to player screen. To be honest, I'm not sure what the difference really is, but I think add to player screen might be for like co-op, like if you have split screen and everything like that. So we're just going to add to viewport, since this is going to be a simple demonstration in a single player environment. And with add to viewport, you can also give it a Z order. 0 is the very bottom order, so 0, if this is 0 and then you put something else on top of it with Z order 1, the one that's Z order 1 will be on top. But we're not going to have more than one element on screen at a time, so Z order 0 is perfect. Now, if we play, we should just see a huge screen of white. And we do. So, we know we did something right. So now, what we're going to do is get rid of this image, just so it doesn't hurt our eyes. And what we're going to do now is actually import the art assets that we need. So I'm just going to create a new folder. We'll just call it character textures, or we could just do textures. And these are something I did on my own through Photoshop. They're not my textures, they're League of Legends characters, I believe. I play a little bit of that, but I don't play much games anymore. But I just typed in, you know, character portraits. What I'll do as well, I'll put a link in the description to like a Google Drive space where I'll have these images for you. You can download. They're just Targa files. I think they're 256 by 384, some number like that. So I have 10 character portraits and a background. So I'm just going to select all of them and just import them. Let Unreal do its thing. And this laptop's not that good, so it takes a second. I'm just going to right click, save all, make sure they're all good. And just to give you a preview, this is what it looks like. What I like to do is go into each one and put them into the texture group UI. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm going to fast forward the video from here, just to let you know what I'm doing. For each of these portraits, I'm going to texture group, changing it from world to UI. So I'll be doing that to all of these portraits in the background. So now the video is going to speed up. Okay, now that we have all of our portraits and our background set up with the texture groups at the UI, let's go ahead and just set up our main character selection screen. For now, what that entails is just the background image and a blur. So let's put an image back in. And what you can do under brush, just expand that, and then image. This is where you can choose your texture. You can also make it a material if you really want. For now, textures are fine. There's our texture. And I made the image size 1920 by 1080. And what I can do now, because that's the scale that I want, I can just use this nifty checkbox for size to content. And boom, it's the full screen. And my screen resolution right now is 1920 by 1080. It says 1280 by 720, but it's a 16 by 9 ratio, so it still works. If you have an image that's not exactly like that, and you still wanted to expand that width of the screen, you do a couple of different options. You could just set the X to 1920 to 1080 and you got it. Or you could do what I did earlier with that other image and set this here, the anchor to the full screen of anchor, and just zero out all these offset. So, and you can do that. There's not a big difference with anything. And at this point, if you hit size, the content's going to look the same. So I'm just going to leave it like that. And then I like to name my elements. So image, I'll just type in background. And usually when you name variables customly, it automatically makes it a variable, but we don't need it to be a variable, so we can just uncheck that. And now this is where you may have something different if you're not working with 4.15 Unreal. In this one, they introduced blur. So you can do background blur and just throw it in. And obviously you can set the size of the blur. You can make it any size at all. Obviously I wanted to take up the whole screen. So I can just do this whole auto anchor here with the full screen. Just hit it like that. And as you'll notice, you don't see anything yet. And that's because we haven't put any blur values in. So you could do a couple different things. You could draw an image if you want, but that's no need for that. We're just going to do simple blur. So we can try a couple different values, see what you like. You can go heavy as hell. You can go light as hell. It doesn't really matter. I think a value of 2 is fine. Let's see, 5. 3. Yeah, 3 is good. So I set the blur strength here to 3. Do whatever you think looks nice. And that's pretty much our background. So let's go ahead and just preview that, see if it looks good. And yeah, looks pretty good. See, there's nothing more to it yet. We haven't drawn our portraits or anything like that, but it's a good start. So what we're going to do now, we're going to come back to this UMG in a minute, but what we're going to first now do is make a new UMG element for the actual portrait itself. So my naming convention with the UI stuff is just BP_UI and then, whatever you want to name it. So character selection _ portrait is what I want to call it. So let's open this bad boy up. And what we'll need is, I usually like to keep, when it comes to like different things where you actually select it, potentially need to click on anything, your go-to really is a button. But I also like to keep things into a container. So first I'm going to go put a vertical box. I like to name these things because I'm a little anal like that. I'm just going to call this character portrait container. And now we'll take our button. Now our button, it needs an image. And obviously we're going to dynamically change the image when we start adding these portraits into the screen. But for now, just as a preview, let's just put someone in. So let's go ahead under... Actually, yeah, we don't want to do that there. We want to do an image. Sorry about that. Drop an image onto the button. And just so you know, the button, it can only have one child. So just be wary of that. And let's also name our button here. Let's just call it character portrait button. Let's name our image as well, character portrait. And we'll want this as a variable, and you'll see why in a little bit. But now, let's go ahead and put in our portrait. So we can pick anybody here. Portrait 10 is fine. And as you can see, it's not visible that well. And this is where the size to content is really going to come in. It's going to fit perfectly. And there we go. But as you can see the button gray outline. We don't really want that. So what we can do is, under background color, just make the alpha 0, and you'll see it go away. And that's pretty much our button, or our portrait, I should say. So the biggest thing now, let's first add them to the character selection main. So let's go back to our main selection. And what we're going to want to do is, I like to use, in this instance, is a grid and a uniform grid panel. So let's throw that guy in. We'll name this character portrait grid. We'll want it as a variable. And I want to throw this right into the center of the screen. So what we can do is alignment, dead center, also, anchor to the center, and alignment 0.5, 0.5, just so it's directly in the center, and just zero out the X and Y. And we'll also want to do size to content. And that's just because it will expand on its own as we add our children. So let's go ahead and let's go into the actual blueprint graph. Here we go. And now we're going to want to create a function. We're going to call it add children. And so don't forget, let's just throw add children to construct. And add children, this is basically where we're going to want to add our portraits. So the first thing I usually do when I add children, I always just clear the children of the grid or the container just to make sure that there's no overlap or duplication of anything. And then we're going to need a couple of variables here. Let's go. We're going to make them local variables. They don't need to be a global variable. The first is going to be an integer called local underscore row, and change that to int. Okay. And now we're going to need. We can make this next one a global variable. And we'll call it portraits. And this is actually going to be a texture. So find texture reference and click here next to the word texture, change it to an array. And this is where we're going to actually add all of our elements. And by elements, I just mean literally the textures. So we have 10 portraits. So let's just add all of them. There we go. So we created 10 elements because we had, and it's going to be 0 through 9, but that equals 10 when you count from 0. And I'm just going to add all of the portraits in order. So let's do that really quick. And the reason why I'm doing this is just so I know how many elements to loop over, because I'm going to do a for each loop here. So that's always good to know. I prefer using for each loops more than I do for loops. Sorry. There we go. Because for each loops, it really limits the chances of getting like an index out of range kind of errors. So that's always nice. So now that we have our portraits array, what we'll want to do is grab it, do a get, type in for each. And now we'll need a couple of local variables. So the array element, just pull the pin, type in, choose local variable, and I'm going to do local, and we'll just do portrait. And I also want to grab the index, because we're going to use that to do a little bit of calculations to determine what row and what column certain elements are going to be in. So pull array index, local variable, just call it local index, nothing special. And now this is where we can go ahead and create our widgets. So get create widget, sorry. And owning player, let's just type in get owning player. And our class is going to be portrait. And I like to create a local variable here as well. So local portrait underscore widget should be fine. Let's connect these guys up. And this is actually the point where we kind of want to go back and go back to our portrait and create a new function that we're going to need. So let's go back to our portrait, go to the graph, let's create a function, and it's going to be called set portrait texture or image, whatever you want to call it. Because at this point, when we're looping through our array in the character selection screen, we want to call this function and assign it the portrait in that indexed array. So what we can do is grab our character portrait image. That's why we made it a variable. And we're going to first do get brush. And we're going to right click the brush and split the construction pin. And the reason why we're going to do that is because we then need to get a copy of the portrait and do set brush, break its in brush, and let's connect it to our function. And the reason why we're doing a get brush and set brush is because we want to copy a lot of the same parameters over. So our image size matches, our draw as matches, the margin, tint, tiling, mirroring, everything matches. The only thing we want to make unique is the incoming brush image. So we're not going to bring that over. We're actually going to just pull it out, connect it to our function, and it'll automatically have in brush image as an input for our function. We can then just change it to portrait. So it's at least the naming conventions. What's the word I'm looking for? Consistent. So now we have that function, which is great. So what we could do now is from our local portrait widget, we can just say set portrait image. And now we can use our local portrait as the image. So when we go through our for each loop, the first one creates it and sets the local portrait to the one that's at index 1, index 2, index 3, things like that. So now what we can do is grab our grid and do add child or add children. So add child to uniform grid. And the child we want to add is the portrait widget itself. So local portrait widget. So at this point you might think we're done, but there's actually a really big problem, and you're going to see why. As you can see, we only have one image on screen, even though we're drawing 10 of them because that's in our portrait array. And if you'll notice, it's the last image that's showing. And technically all of them were drawn, but the way uniform grids work is unless you assign a column and a row, you're basically going to be drawing them in the same exact place. So actually right now there's 10 of these portraits drawn in the same exact location. They're just overlapping one another. So what we need to do is basically assign rows and columns to each one. And this is where we're going to go ahead and make a new variable, and we're going to do some unique math. But if you're familiar with arrays and making columns and rows, you'll know what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to make a variable called local underscore row size. And what I'm going to do is it's going to be an integer, not an array, just a single variable. And I'm going to make it a default 5. So maybe a better name is local column size, but basically what I'm trying to kind of say is in each row, there's 5 max elements that I want in each one. So in row 1, it's going to draw basically at row 0, column 0, and then row 0, column 1, row 0, column 2, all the way up until 4, which is technically 5, again counting from 0. So what we'll need to do, from the return value of our uniform grid, we can do set column. And what we need to do is a little bit of modulus math. Sorry, I'm just looking at some notes. We'll need to take the index and do a modulus math. So if you just type in the %, you'll get a modulo. And if you're not familiar with modulus, you basically do a division between two integers, but it returns the remainder. So what we're going to divide by is row size. And then the result is going to go to the column. So basically what this is saying, so at local index 1, or 0 I should say, 0 divided by 5. 0 is going to be the remainder. So we're going to set this at column 0. And then local index 1, the modulus from 5 is 1, so on to 2, 3, 4. And then when it's equal to 5, that's where we kind of want to break. So we're going to need to do something special here. Let's first drag out from here of our uniform grid and do set row. And what we're going to set this to is local row. But there needs to be a certain point where we change the row. And what we're going to change that by is taking the result of our modulus and checking if it's equal to our row size. But not just our row size, the row size minus 1. So we're basically checking, hey, is the modulus equal to 4? And then if it is, do a branch. And if it's true, we just want to increment local row. And something else I forgot to do, I believe, we want to zero out local row at the start. So we always wanted to make it 0. Because again, we want to, every time we call add children, we kind of want to start over from the beginning. So let's see if that works. So remember before, all the portraits were drawn in the same location. Let's see what happens now. And there we go. Looks pretty good. See, we don't have any animations yet. We don't have anything fancy. But we have it drawing what we would like it to draw. And I know this is a little bit confusing because of that math. So let me just go ahead and try to explain it again. So basically we have right now 10 elements. And we basically want to have, you can have any arbitrary number in terms of this row size. As you can see, I have 5 columns in each row. So I could, if I really wanted to, make the row size bigger, smaller, doesn't really matter. So I can go in here, row size, I can make it 4. And we'll have some leftovers in a third row. But you can make it, like I said, any row size that you want. And if you really want to do something crazy, you could do something like 2. And there might be a problem, it might go off screen. Yeah, as you can see, you're not seeing all the characters. So a cool thing to do, just as a little extra information, our uniform grid, we can wrap it with a scale box. I just want to name this character grid scale box. And the scale box, scale to fit should be what we want, but basically now it should scale them so you see all of them. See, it doesn't do that. Let's do fill. Okay, it's not doing what I thought it was gonna do. Kind of curious as to why. I think it's because we have size to content. So if we actually change this size to, like, I don't know, 1920 by 1080. And now we have it kind of showing all of the characters. Obviously they spread them out in kind of weird ways. They don't draw them all the way. But that might be where the scale to fit comes in. And it may be a good idea not to make the whole thing 1920 by 1080. But, as you see, as it scales it, looks pretty good. You might want to change the size overall, though. Like, I don't know, 800 to 600. Let's do 1600. So they're going to come out really small. But you see how it scales. So just be wary of that. You might need to scale box. You may want to choose better what you're using. So I'm going to leave the scale box here. I'm just going to do size to content again. Make my row size 5. And let's just double check to make sure it's still working. It is. Perfect. So now this is where we kind of get the fun stuff, in my opinion. This is where we go ahead and make our portraits kind of come to life a little bit. And that's through an animation. So animation, you can do a bunch of different things. You basically can alter most of the parameters you see on the details panel. So let's go ahead. What we want to do is kind of make it get a little bigger and kind of make it stand up. That makes it look like it's getting bigger and being overlaid over everyone else. So we're going to do it actually through the character portrait. Because if we do it with the button, there's some bugs with that. You don't really want to move the button location, because if your mouse is at a certain location, maybe towards the bottom, and you move it up, it's going to unhover and it's going to kind of like flicker. So we really want to do it just to the image. So let's first grab our image and let's just make sure it fills horizontally and vertically. And we'll want the padding to be kind of universal. So we make it 0. You're going to see it kind of snaps into place. And if we make it 4, it kind of brings everything in. But it looks, pretty good at 4. But let's see. I'm trying to find good values here. Sorry about that. Fill might be good. The reason why it's not getting smaller is because this is checked to size to content. So sorry about that. Let's go look at the image. Let's see how big it is. 256 by 360. Now that we're not sizing the content, if we put in a border, you see it gets smaller now. Before it wasn't doing that. So sorry about that, guys. So let's make it 20. Just something exaggerated right now. So 20 padding all the way around. Again, the change we made is instead of size the content, we made the size X and size Y the same size as our brush image, 256 by 360. So now that we have padding where we want it, now if we play again, you'll notice there's going to be big spaces in between each person now, which is good, kind of like what we want. So let's go back into our portrait, and now we're going to do the animation. So let's hit animation. We'll call it selection anim. Select that, add, and do character portrait. And I believe, yeah, we'll need to do the button slot because we're going to change really the padding and as well as the transform. So I like to make these animations about 0.1 seconds long. So first let's hit the track here next to the button slot and do padding first. So at 0 seconds, we'll hit this plus here. It adds a keyframe for all of them, just to confirm that it's there. And at 0.1 seconds, we'll make this 0 and pad again with the key here. And now, if we play, boom, it gets bigger. And then we'll also want to do character portrait, the track on that. Not the button slot this time, but also just do transform. Let me make this a little bigger. Now for transform, we're only going to do translation. So if you scroll down on our details panel, you'll eventually see transform. Let's open that up. Translation, I don't remember if it's negative or positive. I think it's negative 10 we want because it goes up. Let's do negative 20. So first let's keyframe at the beginning of translation, and then at 0.1 do 20 or negative 20. And then hit the keyframe again. Now if we play, it looks pretty good. Okay. Now that we got that done, let's save and deselect everything. And usually, I don't know if this is a bug with UMG, but when you deselect the animation, sometimes it sets all the values back to what you had put it as the file part of your keyframe. So just make sure you put everything back to their default values. So set the padding back to 20 and then the translation back to 0. And now we basically need to set it up so that when we hover over it, we play the animation. When we unhover, we reverse that animation. So let's select our button. Let's do on hover. Let's also do hover, or unhovered, I should say. And now under animations, we have our selection anim. Pull that out. Do play animation. And play mode forward, start at time 0 is fine. Number of loops to play, just 1. Playback speed is 1, that's fine. And then on unhovered, we do reverse. And this should be enough for us to check it out. So let's compile, save. As you see, it works pretty well. It's a little different than what I had before. Maybe we can exaggerate more of the translation. So we can go back to our animation. scroll down to translation again. Make sure you're at the keyframe you want to be. Let's do negative 100. Let's get crazy. And again, that bug I mentioned, just make sure everything's back to their normal positions. Otherwise, you'll see them incorrectly at that point. I believe I made a mistake. I didn't hit the add keyframe. Sorry about that. Let's go back to translation. Negative 100. Add keyframe, and now we're good. Okay. Sorry about that. This is kind of what happens when you do things off the spot of your head. But now it's more exaggerated. That looks a little better to me, at least. Play it around with those values, see what you like most. That's pretty much this tutorial up to this point. But I'll show you how to do a little bit more at this point. And what I'm going to show you what to do is be able to click. And once it's clicked, if you try to unhover, it won't unhover. But if you then have it clicked and then you click another one, it will unhover the previous one that you've clicked. Just so you guys know what that looks like and how it would function. So bear with me just a second. I'm looking at some notes. Let's go ahead and go back. This is all going to be done in our portrait. And we're going to need we're going to need a new event, the click event. So on clicked for our button. And we're going to need two variables. We'll call it be selected. Let's make it exposed. And be hovered. So basically, and let's make that exposed. Basically, these two Boolean variables are going to help us out to determine which elements are already hovered, which ones are already clicked, things like that. So first, let's set things up for hovering and unhovering. We don't need anything for constructor event tick, so let's get rid of those guys. So I'd like to create custom events here. So custom event, and let's call it hover portrait. And let's do the same thing for unhover. Unhover portrait. And thinking about this logically, when something's hovered, or when we hover something, we basically want to check if it's selected. Because if it's already selected, we don't want the hover animation to play again. So go from selected. I like to use not Booleans, just so when I do a branch, the true path gets executed. I don't like when things are, if I only have one execution path, I'd rather that execution path be true and not false. It might be just the way my mind works. But if it's not selected, when we hover over it, yeah, we want it to hover, and we also want to set be hovered to true. Now, if we unhover something, let's take our hovered event, and there's going to be a reason why we do this. I'll explain it when the time comes. But with the hover portrait, this custom event, we don't want to check this logic here. We just want to directly play animation and make hover true. So now let's make some space here. Now when something's unhovered, we want to check two things. We want to check if it's hovered already, and we want to check if it's selected. So let's grab both of these, and we want to check if they're both not. So both have not, and we'll need an AND Boolean. So if these both conditions are true, that's when we want to go ahead and move forward, reverse our animation, and set hovered to false. And let's make sure our custom event's in there. So there are our hover events. So now let's do our click events. So first, when we click, we want to first check if we are selected. And we'll do a not Boolean in this case too. So now if it's not selected, that's when we want to make selected to true. And then that's where we're going to want to do a couple other things as well. Give me just a second. Sorry about this. Okay, so at this point we need a custom function. And what this function is going to do, it's going to unhover other portraits that are selected already. So unhover, or I don't know what we would want to call it. We'll call it deselect other portraits. Whatever floats your boat with that naming convention. And what we want to do is get all widgets of class. We don't really want to do top level only. That doesn't really matter for us. And the widget class is portrait. And we're going to loop through these. And the first thing we're going to do, we're just going to check if it's valid, because we don't want to mess with any invalid objects. And the good thing about the get all widgets of class, it returns it as the class itself already, so you don't have to do any unnecessary casting. So now what we want to do, we want to check if this is selected. And if it is, that's when we want to set selected to false. Sorry, wrong pin. Set selected. And then from these elements we want to call unhover. That should be all we need. So let's go ahead and do deselect other portraits in here. And then we want to do one last check. We want to check if the portrait that we're clicking on is hovered or not. So if it's not hovered, that's when we want to call that hovered function. And the reason why we're calling hovered here is because first we're not checking if it's selected or not. And this is basically when we click on something, that's basically if we click on it and unclick it and not move the mouse, it won't play any unnecessary animations. And so basically now all we have to do, if it's not selected, we go ahead and select it, deselect other ones, and hover it if we need to. If it is selected, that's when we want to make it not selected, and then unhover. So I know that was a lot, but this should work. Okay. So the unhovering doesn't seem to work anymore. So let's see what we did wrong. Everything looks right. Let's do a little debugging. Let's add a breakpoint. There's our breakpoint. Okay, so this is not returning what we thought it would return, which is strange. Everything looks right according to my notes. Let's take a look and debug it. Might need a... okay. I don't think we need a not here for hovered. Let's get rid of our breakpoint. There we go. Now we select it, and now that's not working. It's interesting. Let me see. This is really curious. Sorry about this. Everything was working on my other version. I guess we'll have to debug together. So we click it. But when we click it, we don't want that animation to play again. So that's already wrong. So let's put debug there. So why is that true? Because at that point it should not be, it should be hovered. Oh, I know what's up. We forgot another check here. So we want to check if it's valid, of course. But we also want to make sure that this element that we're looking at, we want to make sure it doesn't equal the portrait that we're using. So let's make an and. So we basically want to say, hey, is this one selected? Okay. And is it not our current portrait? Okay. And then unselect it and do everything like that. There we go. Now that's the functionality we want. Perfect. So we click it, unhover it, doesn't unhover, hover it again, doesn't hover again, and then if we click a new one, perfect. Now if you notice when I click it, it kind of pushes in a little bit. If you don't want that, all you really need to do is go to the button itself and the press pad. You could just make it 2, so it's the same value as the normal padding. So when you click on it, you don't get an extra push. And you can also add other things, like you could do another animation when you click it. You can change the color of things. You do a lot of things at that point. But that's pretty much it. So there's going to be more to this tutorial series. Again, it might be 2 or 3 parts because I'm going to add a little bit more so that when you click on a character, it'll push these guys back, maybe blur them a bit, and then throw in a huge portrait of that character as well. And then maybe some more details on who the character's name is, if you want to cancel or continue, stuff like that. So definitely try that on your own as well, but I will work on that. Might come in the next week or 2, depending on how busy I am with work. But thanks so much, guys, for watching. I apologize for some of the debugging and troubleshooting, but I hope you did learn a lot. Let me know in the description, let me know in the comments what you guys think. And let me know what else you want to learn. If there's other stuff about UMG you want to know about, a lot of topics on that. A lot of the work I've been doing at my work in game development has been in UMG. So if you have any questions or want any tutorials, let me know, and I'll definitely look into them for you. But until next time, guys, thanks so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.
I just wanna run to you and break off the chains and throw them away. I just wanna be so much and shake off the dust that turned me to rust.